Come on. Oh, there we go. Thank you, YouTube. Anyway, good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and let's just get some water. Tonight, I am having a drink that I'm going to call the French Pole because it's got a French liquor and a Polish vodka in it, as well as some lemon juice. But that's actually really good, I'm embarrassed to say. Oh, wow. So today we're going to be ranking the presidents on a tier list from... Actually, I'm going to delete this row. We're going to be using the American school grading system, and the way I'm ranking this is not necessarily based off of whether or not I agree with the president in question. It is how I would grade this president, the president in question that I'm discussing, on a how to be president of the United States. How to be president 101. And I'm going to do this. We're going to go in order from George Washington up until the point when I say that it's too recent in terms of history in order to properly rank or grade a president, because political biases as well as personal biases, I think, will make it really impossible to really look at any president. If I wanted to go very extreme, I'd say you can't really evaluate it past World War II, because a lot of people, there are people who voted in, say, 1952 who are still alive and voting today. I think it'd be wrong to limit myself there, but since it's 2020, I figure I can go back, I can say anything before 1988 is kosher and fair game. I used to have it that it was before 1980 anything was fair game, but 1988 is going to be my new deadline until we reach, say, 2024, 2028. Okay? So, to the lone viewer I have, hi, how are you doing? How's it going? Right. So, you know what? I'm gonna... Oh, yay, there you go. Thanks. And what we're going to be doing is, I'm not just going to be ranking them, I'm going to be kind of discussing their presidency, why I put them there, just kind of spreading it up a little bit. Cool. And spread that one a little bit more. One more place to go. Cool. There we go. Hopefully, I actually have some more viewers. So we're going to go ahead and start with George Washington, who it's fairly easy to say I would easily give him an A. After all, he set a lot of precedents of the office that we have come to like and view as essential to the office today, such as only deciding to serve 2 terms when he easily could have served for life. The cabinet, of course, he recognized that he would need advisors, numerous advisors, and so he appointed them. And he considered himself an independent, and he tried to hear all sides of a discussion and a debate. And he did not like the growing factions and partisanship within his own government. And he was probably the only person the entire nation was able to unify around. We'll get to another one at some point, but let's just say Washington gets the easy A. He kind of breezed through the course. Now let's see if I can find the next one, John Adams. Here we go. And a lot of people really aren't going to like my rating of him. He still gets a passing grade, but I don't think he can justifiably get a grade higher than a D. Simply because at the end of the day, John Adams was, well, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Anybody who knows me knows I very much like free speech. And, well, John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts violated that flagrantly. He almost got us into a war with France. Look up the Quasi War. And while he was very much a solid president in some areas, a lot of his policies, not much, Ryan, not much. A lot of Adams' policies were just, they didn't match with the rest of the nation, and the fact that he was such an easy target in 1800 that he wound up losing his re-election bid kind of goes to show that most of the nation at the time didn't view him as a very good president. So anyway, we move on to Thomas Jefferson, who, on the other hand, people nowadays look on him negatively because he owned slaves, and I do suppose that is a very fair judgment call to make. I'm not going to argue. Hey, Ahmed. Glad to see you here. I think it's a very fair judgment call to say that Jefferson, had a lot of personal failings, but interestingly enough, he really did fight as hard as he could to try and limit the expanse of slavery across the nation. From actually signing a bill while he was governor of Virginia. Now, this was not while he was president, but when he was governor of Virginia, for example, he signed a bill that outlawed the importation of new slaves. He did the same thing as president with regards to Louisiana. When he purchased a territory, he said that you could not import slaves into the Louisiana territory. And, of course, he did make the Louisiana Purchase, which is probably the best transaction the United States has ever made, perhaps, I want to say. I think that would be a very fair thing to say. What was it, 10 million for probably the most fertile land on earth? It was 10 million for New Orleans, and then the rest of the territory was 5 million. So you got a major shipping port for 10 million, and then the most fertile land on earth for 5 million. I think somebody did the estimation, and that land is probably worth in the $1 to $2 trillion range. I think it's fair to say that alone would put him there. Of course, he established the U.S. foreign policy of we do not negotiate with terrorists, as well, and that was the Barbary Wars, for anybody who isn't sure what I mean by that, where the U.S. legitimately fought pirates in the Mediterranean. And that's not a joke. I actually think I did a video on that a while back. At that time, the U.S. fought a war against pirates. Anyway, so let us go to James Madison, who I'm giving a B simply because while he continued a lot of very good policies from the Jefferson administration, which, by the way, I will say Jefferson was not quite, a solid A. He was kind of A minus range, borderline B plus, simply because of his interactions with Aaron Burr after Burr had been ousted as vice president. But anyway, James Madison continued a lot of good policies from the Jefferson administration. Unfortunately, got us into a war. And it was kind of an unwise war, even though most people consider the War of 1812 to be a bit of a wash. I think it would be fair to say that it was a war that we really probably shouldn't have fought, and there was no reason to fight it. And it didn't really do anything except affirm that, yes, the U.S. is an independent nation, and Britain kind of got bored, and the U.S. kind of got bored. But because the Federalists continued to advocate for closer ties to Britain while we were at a war with Britain, people kind of forget that the war didn't look too great on the Democratic Republicans, or the National Republican Party, as it was called back then. So, yeah. Most people just remember Madison as the guy who actually wrote down the Constitution. Maybe not created the whole thing, but he wrote the U.S. Constitution. And his notes, which I do have somewhere in my office, his notes from the Constitutional Convention are invaluable to any true historian. So let's go to James Monroe, who gets kind of an easy grade because his time in office was known as the era of good feelings. And there's a very good reason for that. By the time he left office, and actually it was really by the time he was running for his second term, there was only one party. Plus the success of Republican positions really did benefit the nation tremendously, and I think it's unfair to say that Monroe did a bad job. I would say I'm actually going to rate Monroe above Jefferson. So basically, the further to, closer to the grade it is, the higher the grade they got relative to the other people in their category, right? But yeah, Monroe did a very good job. But he was also fairly moderate for a Republican. He wasn't necessarily as anti-tariff as, say, Madison or Jefferson had been, and he was tracking a path that some of the Whigs would go down later with regards to internal improvements like canals and the very first rail lines, that sort of thing. Telegraph as well was, I think, being invented around this period. Port expansion, road construction, that sort of thing. Who was next? I believe it was John Quincy Adams. See if I can find him. That's Van Buren. Where's Jake Huey? Jake Huey, he's kind of an uneventful president, if you can believe that, especially after the very controversial election of 1824, which he won through the contingency election in the House over Andrew Jackson, who I'll get to in just a minute. But John Quincy Adams, he kind of tracked almost a Monroe-esque position, except a little bit more in favor of tariffs, internal improvements, that sort of thing. And, I genuinely am not going to say that he was great or that he was bad. Oh, nice. Nice. I'll definitely look at that, Nuxmaster. But yeah, I'm not going to say anything great or overly negative about John Quincy Adams. He was a bit too much like his father in some regards, but, he didn't have some of his father's strong-willed tendencies. All right, so now we get on to one of the more fun presidents to discuss, and that's Andrew Jackson. That is Andrew Jackson. And it's really difficult to rank him, because if you're ranking him based off of what most people will, which is the Indian Removal Act, most people are going to put him in the F tier. But if you rank him, say, on paying off the national debt, and that alone, you're going to put him in A tier. Yes, he actually paid off the national debt in its entirety. People like me will like that he... People like me are going to like that Andrew Jackson killed the National Bank. He also, now it said he also greatly expanded the power of the executive. Problem is, he definitely spurned the Supreme Court. While he never said this, this quote is misattributed to him, and truthfully, it was never uttered by anyone. He did say something to the effect of, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, with regards to the case Worcester v. Georgia, which was the Indian Removal Act case, sort of the Indian Removal Act case. But overall, I would have to give him a solid B. But because of the Indian Removal Act and spurning the court, I do have to put him under James Madison. Truthfully, I think anywhere, like if you wanted to put him in F tier, I'm not going to argue with that. However, if you look at the whole of his policies, as well as the general success of the nation during his tenure in office, I think it's unfair to say that he was a bad president. Now, of course, Andrew Jackson was very famous for, well, being Andrew Jackson, and this is where I'm going to digress and just talk about how crazy of a person he was. His favorite hobby was dueling, in which he's purported to have participated in hundreds in his lifetime during his tenure in the office. It's estimated he probably participated in 100 such duels at a minimum. Though the amount that he actually did participate in is up for debate. He definitely killed people during these duels. And Andrew Jackson kind of, to me, seemed like the 1800s version of Florida Man. He was the first president to have an assassination attempt made on him. And somehow the person was crazier than Andrew Jackson was. It was Richard Lawrence III who decided that Andrew Jackson could travel through space and time and killed Lawrence's father. So, and Lawrence, of course, was so crazy he thought he was the rightful king of England, and that killing Andrew Jackson would prove it. His pistols both misfired, and then Andrew Jackson proceeded to beat the ever-loving shit out of Richard Lawrence with his cane. And the president's aides, Andrew Jackson's aides, had to pull Andrew Jackson off of the would-be assailant. That was back in the day when old Hickory. Yeah, that was back in the day when when the president's aides were there to protect you, not the president. And Andrew Jackson, oh boy, Andrew Jackson, he Yeah, by the way, one of those people who was with Andrew Jackson who pulled him off of his would-be assailant was Davy Crockett. When Davy Crockett is saving you from Andrew Jackson, you know something has gone wrong. And to quote, and by the way, I don't actually like Jackson as a president. He did only two things that I actually genuinely like. One of those is, of course, killing National Bank, and the other is paying off the national debt. But I would never vote for him because he was a complete asshole. And I know when I die, I'm going to wind up facing a duel against Andrew Jackson because I said that. So wish me luck when I get to heaven. But no. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Yeah. No, Andrew Jackson he was a jerk. Anyway, so we're going to go on to Little Van, who oversaw an economic recession and was really just a third term of Andrew Jackson, except without the insanity of Andrew Jackson. And by the way, Jackson had a pet parrot, who liked to cuss. So much so that the parrot had to be removed from Jackson's funeral. Anyway, yeah, Van Buren, he oversaw the Panic of 1837, and his presidency is remembered as a failure. Gee, I wonder why. But, and truthfully, the only reason why he even won his presidential election is the Whigs decided to try this crazy strategy of running 4 candidates, hoping to throw the election to the House. Yeah, it didn't work. It really didn't work. Oh well. Moving on to the next president, we have the first president that I am not going to rank. And as soon as I can find him, you'll understand why. And that is William Henry Harrison. The reason why I'm not going to rank William Henry Harrison, or Old Tippy Canoe as he is known, is, to put it simply, he served only 31 days in office, so there's no reason. He didn't even have enough time to put together a full cabinet. So instead, we move on to, as soon as I can find him, where is John Tyler? There he is. There is John Tyler, who I'm also giving a D. I will put Van Buren above John Adams just because he didn't violate freedom of speech. But anyway, John Tyler, he had a mixed presidency. His own party hated him, but I think that was mostly because Tyler was not in the mold of the typical Whigs. I think most people definitely assumed that Tyler was just a Democrat in Whig clothing, or whatever you want to say. A lot of them didn't even consider him the true president, just the acting president, because there was no actual official line of succession. And we managed to get, 1840? Yeah, managed to get to 1841. So a good 60 years without having to answer the question of what happens if a president dies or resigns. So, yeah. Now, Tyler was very much a manifest destiny person. He was very much a fan of expansion, and he didn't hate the idea of slavery like a lot of Whigs were starting to. But his presidency is marred by the fact that he couldn't even get his own party on his side. So it didn't work out quite so well. In 1844, we had James Knox Polk, who manages to get himself a C because, well, his presidency was basically annexation of Texas, which, whatever you want to say about the annexation of Texas and all the shenanigans leading up to it, as well as the Texas Revolution, by the point that it was annexed by the United States, it was kind of a well-recognized fact internationally that Texas was its own independent nation, and that if they wanted to join the U.S., they could. That was a generally regarded international thing. The question in the U.S. was, should the United States annex Texas? And, well, Democrats favored it because Texas had a climate that was conducive to a certain practice known as slavery. Whereas a lot of Whigs were ambivalent about it, except for the Cotton Whigs, who were Southern, as well as, there were also a lot of Whigs who believed in 54-40 or fight, which was with regards to the Oregon Territory. In addition, we'll get to Nixon. We'll get to Nixon at some point. But yeah, Polk, he annexed Texas, and if you look at it from a financial standpoint, that was second only to the Louisiana Purchase in terms of the value of the territory that was annexed. Maybe you could make maybe you could make an exception to that and say Alaska is worth a lot more. Certainly in terms of raw land total, Alaska is worth a lot more. But, we still don't know about the complete resource richness of Alaska. And it's 2020, and that deal was made in 1867. Texas is a lot more of a known quantity. It has a lot of the same resources that Alaska does. And Texas also is a valuable trading port in a lot of areas. Corpus Christi, Galveston, Houston. And there's a lot of agricultural land and area in the Great Plains region, as well as East Texas. So in the end, I think it's hard to. That said, it did require a war to to make sure everything held out. But that war lasted through. It started in what, 18? Was that 1848? Was it 1848? No, it wasn't. It was. I think it was 46 to 48. So basically the entire second. The guy between Washington and Jefferson is James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States. Famous for the Monroe Doctrine. I kind of actually forgot to talk about that, but the Monroe Doctrine is basically the United States is going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, and if you don't like that, you can suck a big fat one and decolonize, or we'll whoop your ass. But in terms of domestic policy, I think we have to admit that Polk was a fan of slavery, and that is not good. Now, we're going to move on to the next president, which is Zachary Taylor, a Mexican war hero who managed to die about a year and 3 months, or not too long into his presidency, but not nearly as soon as Tippecanoe. Yeah, he doesn't get a very good one because he didn't really get to do much. He did have enough to grade, but it was it was lackluster and very forgettable, and all he did was become a president, and he was a war hero. He hadn't even voted in his entire life leading up to this election. He was not a political person, and he was just there. So Yeah. What was the name of his vice president who assumed the presidency? Was it Fillmore? I want to say it was Fillmore. I want to say it was Fillmore. It's actually a very good question. I'm actually looking this up to make sure I got it correctly. Okay. Got Zachary Taylor. Yes, I was correct. It was Fillmore. There we go, and let's just match the picture. There we go. Here's Millard Fillmore, who kind of set the nation on the path of civil war because of, at the end of the day, Fillmore was what was at the time known as a doughface, or a northerner who harbored southern sympathies. Now, I'm a southerner, and yet even I can recognize the failures of a lot of the historical policies of the South, specifically segregation, slavery, that sort of thing. Jim Crow. Actually, one of the big reasons why I'm against gun control is because of its legacy as a Jim Crow era policy. It's not the biggest reason, but it's a significant one. But yeah, so Fillmore, of course, did a lot to appease the South. He was the one who signed the Fugitive Slave Act and tried to allow popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories and expand slavery north of of the Missouri Compromise line. Just no. Oh yeah, this one's Andrew Johnson. Okay. Who was after him? It was Franklin Pierce. And Franklin Pierce also got a D. I could honestly put him in an F, but that's reserved for a special type of failure as president. But Franklin Pierce, of course, also fan of slavery. And that's kind of the big knock. He also didn't really do a lot to... rein in some of the more extreme tendencies of a few southern states, specifically South Carolina. But, yeah, what are you going to do, right? The next president was James Buchanan, who manages to get himself an F. This is the first F I am giving out in the class. And why would I give an F to James Buchanan? Does anybody in the audience want to give a guess as to why James Buchanan gets an F? Anyone? Anyone take a wild swing? Buchanan. Boo. Yeah. Yeah. If anybody wanted to say that he was also a doughface and that he really let the South do whatever they wanted, yeah. He didn't really trigger the war. He just didn't do anything to stop it. He just said, yeah, go right on ahead. No, it's not because Buchanan was gay. Also, he was, but he remained unmarried throughout his entire life, so there is a reasonable rumor to make. But even in that era, and even up into the modern era, a lot of gay men have married and even had kids simply as what's known as cover. So I think in that era, if he really was gay, he would have, done that. Then again, there was also Frederick the Great in Prussia, who absolutely we know for a fact was of the homosexual persuasion. And while he did get married, he never had children, and we definitely know for a fact the historical record's pretty clear on that one. Buchanan gets the big F because he didn't even try to stop secession. He just said, whatever, I'm not going to be president in 3 months. I'm out of here. I'm taking my ball and going home. So now we move on, and I'm going to take a break right here just to get another drink, and I'll be back in about a minute or so. Try and get some more people on, please. I would appreciate it. Alright, I am back, and my cat decided to try and tackle me while I was coming back to this room to live stream, and he kind of caused me to spill my drink. Thankfully, I managed to catch it all. So, we're moving on to the president I think most people rank in A tier. However, let's discuss Abe Lincoln. Let us discuss Honest Abe. So, what did he do that was very good? Well, he managed to push through the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, and set up the ground for the 14th and 15th Amendments. These 3 amendments combined are known as the Civil Rights Amendments. They were very good, and I don't think anybody has any right to criticize them. And the 14th Amendment in particular has been especially useful in incorporating a lot of the Bill of Rights to include the states, as was intended by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. What else did he do that was good? He kept the Union together. It did take his entire presidency, and it did take a lot of effort, and, the Civil War, but he led it admirably, and he kept the Union together. I think and I do agree that with the court at the time that ruled that secession was illegal, that when you signed on and ratified the Constitution, it was a permanent document, and it was a permanent signature, and that you can't secede. So I think he was right in enforcing that. But some bad that he did was he greatly expanded the power of the executive, even more than Jackson did. He was capricious in his managing of the war, even if it did eventually lead to the correct decision to hire U.S. Grant as the general of the Army of the Potomac. But he fired generals left and right. He fired people in his administration almost as much as Donald Trump has done. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And some people will say, well, it was wartime and these were, vaguely Southern sympathetic people who were in prison, but that's still not an excuse. Even during wartime, even during the War of 1812, even during, the Revolution, even during the Civil War, they refused to quarter people in, quarter soldiers in civilian homes because of how badly that would be seen. And yet he's also suspending habeas corpus during wartime, to which there's no exception in the Constitution to do so, unlike the Third Amendment. So if the Third Amendment, which does have an excuse to where you can, an exception where you can station soldiers or quarter them in civilian homes, is too sacred to violate, why all of a sudden is habeas corpus? Why is habeas corpus not sacred? Especially considering this falls under the rights of the accused. I'm not a big fan of this decision. And I don't think it's proper for the president to do. In addition to this, he introduced conscription. In particular, he introduced conscription that would allow wealthy people to not serve if they paid someone else to take, to go in their stead. Lincoln was also not an abolitionist until the war forced his hand. So, yeah, say what you will, but, his presidency is kind of actually mixed. And if he had, I think a lot of people overstate his, I don't think he's as good of a president as a lot of modern commentators will say. I also don't think that he was particularly great either. I don't think he was bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I truly can't rate him higher than the highest B+. And that's simply because he kept the Union together, and yeah, that's really it. He kept the Union together. That's the only reason he's getting a B+. And yes, Lex Layton, you are correct. He probably was the only president who could bring the U.S. through that war. I'm not going to argue with that. Alright, let's go back. Where's Andrew Johnson? There he is. And Andrew Johnson also gets an F. The reason why Andrew Johnson gets an F is he was so obstinate in his opposition to what Congress was doing that the U.S. Congress wanted him gone. They wanted him gone so badly they decided to entrap him by passing a law that they knew he would violate at some point, and then prosecuting him and impeaching him for violating that law. Thankfully, the Senate realized how stupid that was and said, no, we are not going to remove him from office because that is entirely political. Instead, we're just going to vote him out of office in, a year, and we'll be done with him. But Andrew Johnson was also opposed to... Oh no, Johnson vetoed all of the legislation that Congress was passing with regards to the Reconstruction and basically trying to limit executive power. The problem is for Johnson that Congress overrode every single veto that he... No, Johnson vetoed a lot of legislation. It was just overridden because of how much everyone hated him. They're like, well, if Johnson vetoed it, it must be a good bill. Oh, man. Johnson was worse than Buchanan, and it's really hard to beat Buchanan on being bad. It's so hard to do that anytime somebody says, Trump is easily the worst president we've ever had, I always say, but think about Buchanan. And they're like, who? I say, the guy who didn't try to stop the South from seceding. Yeah, okay, so for Mr. K, I'm going to go ahead and explain how Congress and the executive work in conjunction with each other. Basically, Congress, the U.S. Congress or U.S. legislature, has two chambers: the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives is roughly proportional to each state. Basically, each state gets a number of representatives that's set based off of their population. The Senate, every state gets equal representation. Basically, this was a compromise between those who like the Articles of Confederation system, where each state effectively got one vote because you needed unanimous consent, but every state got one vote in the Articles of Confederation, and those who wanted a more democratic and proportional system. There was a compromise made where there would be a bicameral legislature with one house based off of population, the other based off of just because they're a state, you get equal representation. For a bill to pass in Congress, both chambers have to agree that the bill is good enough to pass with a simple majority. Then it goes to the executive branch, who can either sign it or veto it. Now, there are different types of vetoes. There's the line item and the pocket veto, which are the most notable, but there are also a few other ways you can veto legislation. But most of the time, it's just a straight veto. When it's vetoed, the president basically says no and sends it back to Congress saying, think again. However, with 2/3 majority in both chambers, the legislature can override the president's veto and say, no, this is going to be law. And in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, Andrew Johnson wound up having most of his vetoes overridden because of the way Congress was. It was mostly what at the time was called radical Republicans, who were very in favor of equal rights and a more heavy hand in Reconstruction. And yeah, so what wound up happening, like I said, Congress passed what's known as the Tenure in Office Act, and I think I did a video on impeachment when the whole Trump impeachment thing was going on. And eventually, Andrew Johnson violated this, and Congress said, okay, we're going to impeach you. So the House of Representatives held their vote to bring charges forth for high crimes and misdemeanors against Andrew Johnson. They passed it to the Senate, and the Senate voted to acquit on all counts, basically saying this is entirely political. Even if we don't like him, this is entirely political. Anyway, the next president is a Civil War general who was very popular in his own time. And no one hated him. Yet he wasn't a particularly great president. In fact, there was some minor economic problems. His cabinet was extremely corrupt. And he seemed genuinely disinterested in running the nation. That's Ulysses S. Grant. U.S. Grant, as I like to call him. However, people loved him because he was the general who won the American Civil War, the war between the states. And I find it hard to fault him for these failures, as he was a military man through and through. He was not at all the type of person who was brought up to know how to raise or run a nation. And his policy was kind of haphazard. He kind of just consented to whatever Congress wanted to do, so. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just he didn't really leave a mark on the presidency. Right, so after Grant was another Republican with kind of mixed stuff, and the way he got into office was shaky at best. And that was Rutherford B. Hayes. And Hayes, of course, lost the popular vote. He was the first president, in fact, to be elected president despite losing the popular vote. Well, unless you want to count John Quincy Adams in 1824. But he wasn't terrible. He did vote to end Reconstruction, even if he would have rather not done so. But it was a condition on which he would assume the presidency. So he said, I'd rather be president, and I don't think a lot of people would fault him for that. Actually, a lot of people would fault him for that. But he honored his oath. He honored the promise, and at the end of the day, he didn't do a terrible job. He didn't do a great job. He was unnotable in a lot of regards. So, yeah, we're going to go ahead and say that Rutherford Hayes was a C. I'm trying to remember who's the next president. Was it Grover Cleveland? No. It was not Chester Arthur. Garfield, who was shot extremely quickly into his term and died fairly quickly. So he is the second president that I will not grade because he did not have enough time in order to form a coherent policy. However, Chester Arthur actually gets into the B tier and actually gets to sit above James Madison. Why is this? Because Chester Arthur was a surprisingly good president. The reason why I say this is, yeah, remembering all the presidents is a bit difficult. Now, the reason why I say Chester Arthur was surprisingly good is at the time there was these things called political machines, and they kind of controlled everything. They may not have been able to pick the president, but they picked the candidates. And Chester Arthur thought these were extremely shady, even though he had worked within them for most of his career. He handshook his way to becoming the vice president. And then when he got into power, he dismantled the political machines as much as he could. And he generally oversaw what is recognized as a fairly good time in office. And now we get on to another one of our based facial hair politicians. And we get to throw Grover Cleveland into this. Now, a lot of people thought that the Arthur administration wasn't 100% honest. And Cleveland represented honesty. He represented integrity. And he would tell it like it was and work for the common man. Now, this is funny because Cleveland was what was known at the time as a bourbon Democrat. As a matter of fact, Cleveland had a lot more in common with today's Libertarian Party than he does with today's Democrats. And when I say he was a bourbon Democrat, I'm very happy about that. But he favored the gold standard. He was very much a free marketer, and he, in general, was skeptical of certain points regarding big business. Was skeptical regarding certain labor movements. He didn't hate tariffs, but he also didn't like them. He was blasé when it came to domestic policy, and he was generally well liked. Though he did do something dishonest during his presidency. He discovered he had cancer in his brain, and he went off on a ship called the Oneida, and to operate and remove the cancer from his brain, they cut in through his mouth, and his thing is, they cut in through his mouth and did an operation at secret in the middle of the night on a boat, just so that no one would know. They didn't even tell the vice president that Cleveland was having this operation. Oh, I love it, right? I love it. Also, by the way, if you are new to this channel, or new to my content, likes, comments, subscriptions always do help. I am hopefully going to be live streaming on election night. I'm trying to get at least 2 or 3 people to join me, at least for certain portions of the evening, just so that we can cover the election fairly as much as possible, and have a discussion, because I don't think anybody wants to listen to me ramble on for 5 freaking hours on election night. I don't think that'd be terrible. Yeah, so moving on to the next president, and that was Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe. And his presidency is considered a D. I'll bump it up to a C. But he kind of didn't do anything super important. He was elected because he was a Civil War hero, I guess, and no one really liked him. And, he actually lost the popular vote to Grover Cleveland. And to show you how much people regretted the choice of Benjamin Harrison, they put Cleveland back in office after Benjamin Harrison. We had 2. Grover Cleveland lost the election to Benjamin Harrison and then said, yeah, this guy's not doing a very good job. I'm running again. And the people were like, yeah, we agree. We're voting for you, Grover. So they put Cleveland back in office after they kicked him out for the guy he ran against. Right, and now we come to one of the most pivotal elections in American history, 1896, where you have someone saying that he will not be crucified upon a cross of gold, running against a guy who was basically grandpa running on his front porch. And wouldn't you know, William McKinley wins. Unfortunately, William McKinley supported the, I'll say, hostile takeover by American corporations of the Kingdom of Hawaii, as well as the annexation after that. He got us into the slightly dubious Spanish-American War, and even though we kicked the ever-loving crap out of the Spanish, I think it's wrong to say that was a justifiable war. Everybody says the Maine blew up in Cuba, and it did, and that the Spanish were behind it. Well, they weren't. I think most forensic analysis indicates that it was just a freak accident, or maybe even staged. In addition, the U.S. really just wanted colonial possessions, and hilariously, the United States did not get Cuba as a consolation prize. If we had gotten Cuba, maybe Castro wouldn't have come to power, but that would be an alternate history video, which I'm never a big fan of alternate history. Instead, we just tried to colonize the Philippines, and that did not work out at all. Fun fact, our failed attempt at colonization of the Philippines is the reason why the United States adopted the .45 caliber round as its military round, and why Americans to this day, even if we are starting to adopt as civilians a 9mm cartridge, still prefer .45 ACP. But I think that's kind of reading too much into the history, but I at the same time, I don't necessarily agree with that statement that it's reading too much. This is coming from somebody who likes the .45 caliber round. But yeah, no, McKinley was definitely just a solid C. He did some good on the economic and domestic policy front, but he also got us involved in an unnecessary war of imperial expansion that we really didn't need to get involved in. And now we run into the bull moose himself, and because I want to have a drink with him when I get to heaven, hopefully, and go hunting with him, I'm going to rank the bull moose is solidly in A tier. And this is despite the fact that... yes, exactly. And it's not... Yeah. McKinley doesn't just have a mountain named after him. It's the highest peak in North America. But anyway, yeah, I'm putting the bull moose himself in A tier. And the only reason why I'm putting him below Grover Cleveland is he was a bit too progressive, and I don't think some of his policies were necessarily good ideas. I will say this, though, that he absolutely had a very nuanced opinion when it came to trust busting and breaking up of corporate monopolies. His opinion was that if a monopoly wasn't abusing its market stake and wasn't abusing the customer and was providing a good service to the customer despite its market share, his opinion was let it keep going. I'm going to focus on the ones that are actually abusing their power and being harmful to the American people. I like the nuanced look that he had. I also like his conservation-minded spirit, setting up national parks, which did extend to his days before the presidency. After all, he was the one who founded Yellowstone. And by the way, if you get a chance to go to Yellowstone, absolutely do so, and try to time it for a period where you're going to get snow. I went there in the middle of June one year, and it was snowing, and I loved it. Oh, I loved it so much. But yeah, no, Teddy was a very good president for reasons that are, he knew how to handle the power of the office. He may have implemented policies I disagree with. He may have favored some policies that I disagree with. For example, he was actually a fan of single-payer health care. He would have very much been in line with the thinking of his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Get into later because I'm going to get into him. But Teddy was also very much bellicose. He loved intervention. Modern progressives would have loved him, but also modern neocons would have loved him. He very much loved foreign intervention. He loved imperialism, and he wanted America to be the world police. But he also wanted to take care of the average American, and I don't exactly blame him for his motivations, at least on the domestic policy front. On the foreign policy front, I mean, the only thing I appreciate about him was that while he did want to intervene everywhere, he at least wanted to be personally on the front lines. After all, when he was advocating for the United States to get involved in the First World War, he volunteered to go over himself and actually participate in the fighting. In addition, he was one of the first ones up the hill at the famous charge of San Juan Hill. So, yeah, he wasn't one of these people who is sending others to do his dirty work in terms of warfare. He wasn't a why do they always send the poor. He was presidents will fight the war type of person. So, yes, he was definitely a carry a big stick president. He also loved animals. He loved having pets. He had the most pets of any president. But he also liked shooting animals. And like I said, I would love to go hunting with him. I would love to go fishing with him. I do want to have a drink with Teddy Roosevelt whenever I do get to heaven. And then we move on to the next president, who is also based mustache man. And our last president with facial hair, believe it or not. Oh my God, President Roosevelt leading a charge over the Rhine. Oh, now that's a scene for alternate history buffs. President Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, who Roosevelt came to hate, William Howard Taft, who lacked the nuance of his predecessor with regards to monopolies and corporate trusts, despite being a very conservative man and eventually becoming a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. President Taft, he was kind of ham-fisted when it came to executive application of the law. Some of his opinions on the court are brilliant, don't get me wrong. I think he had a better case of interpreting the law over implementing it and executing it. That's my opinion on Taft. He wasn't a terrible president by any means. He just lacked the nuance and understanding of how to wield the power of the office like Theodore did, like Teddy did. But everybody now, the first thing they think about with Taft is he was fat and he had an handlebar mustache. So, yeah, that's kind of where it stands with Taft. Then we get to, oh boy, another president who somehow manages to be worse than Buchanan. And he manages to be worse than Andrew Johnson. And this is Woodrow Wilson. If you want to know more about Woodrow Wilson's presidency and Woodrow Wilson the person, what you have to do is watch The Cynical Historian in his 2-part series on Wilson. And you, like him, will be screaming, Wilson! And truth is, I've actually had him as high, much higher rated before, because I saw him as the person who tried to implement peaceful foreign relations post World War I, as well as trying to convince the rest of the world to allow for self-determination, at least in Europe, but hopefully further abroad, further afield. However, as I've come to know more about Wilson and done more research on Wilson, the worse he becomes in my book. And this is basically fomenting the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. He was excessively racist. Even for his era, he was racist. He resegregated the federal government after Teddy had desegregated it to an extent, as much as was practicable in that era. And Wilson unnecessarily got us into World War I. There was no reason for the U.S. to get involved. And I think at the end of the day, Wilson's presidency was his Messiah complex lived out. And the League of Nations was a failure. It was a dumb idea from the get-go. And it was ridiculous. And it was all part of his Messiah complex. And again, he wasn't really in favor of women's suffrage until the issue was forced upon him. And even then, he was like, yeah, I'd rather not, but I'll do it. And I think Wilson was... If you really want to get where I'm coming from, just watch the Cynical Historians series on Wilson. It's brilliantly researched and it's absolutely correct. Did I forget a president? Oh, no, that's Garfield. Okay, so the next president was Warren G. Harding. Ooh, despite some good economic policy, and that's why I'm pushing him so high, was more corrupt than Ulysses S. Grant. As a matter of fact, Harding actually had a... If it wasn't for the corruption, Harding would easily be in B tier or higher because of his economic and domestic policy. He was very much in the framework of what the Republican Party was, and I would argue still is, in that he favored civil rights as much as was possible back then. And I would say the Republican Party has expanded their view of civil rights, certainly. But he was also a free marketer. He favored reduced taxes. That said, the problem was he was also too easily influenced by senators, congressmen, his cabinet, basically anybody who would give him the time of day. He was an easily influenceable man. He wasn't very firm in his convictions, but he managed to give himself one person who absolutely was, and that was his vice president, who managed to keep Harding on the as straight and narrow as you can get for Harding. And that allowed Harding to have a relatively successful tenure domestically, which was all it was about in the post-World War I era. And then he died of a heart attack. Now, personal foibles aside, Harding was, after all, a rabid womanizer and someone who probably would have endless tabloid fodder thrown upon him in the modern era. But, that's neither here nor there. He did pass away of a heart attack, of course. And now we move on to a president who, well, let's just see where I put him. No, not F tier. Nope, it's not D tier. No, it's not C tier. It's not B tier. Yeah, we're in A tier. And let's just see how far he goes. Yes. Calvin Coolidge, Washington I probably would have given like a 95. Coolidge I would have given like a 99. The only thing I disagree with him on is tariffs. And some other things. He enforced prohibition even though he was personally against it. But no, Coolidge was incredibly intelligent. Not only was he incredibly intelligent, but his heart and his brain said the same thing. They were in the same place, and this meant that he was able to apply his presidential philosophy consistently. During his administration, he cut taxes significantly. The top tax rate when he took office was 50%, and he cut it in half to 25%, and he didn't think it was far enough. But revenue increased when he cut taxes. He used it to shrink both the federal government, but also the federal debt. Coolidge expanded rights for Native Americans. He fought as hard as he could to get anti-lynching laws passed through Congress. He was so broadly popular, everyone was in shock when he said, "I'm not going to run for a second term." In 1928, he said, "I have done enough. 8 years in Washington is enough," even though he only served 5 of those as president. He said he was returning home. In addition, he had some personal tragedy strike. Of course, his son died while he was president. He also had he also had witnessed two of the past 3 presidents either get extremely sick. Wilson had a stroke before he left office, and Harding, of course, died while in office, fall into extremely deep illness or death the presidency. So he was concerned about potentially dying in office too. So he said, "I've had enough, I'm going home." And he did. Now, some people will blame him for the market crash of 1928, but he saw the market was climbing too high, and he said it is not the place of the federal government to interfere. New York, if they wish to regulate the market, can, but it is not the place of the federal government to do so. It is unconstitutional to do so. In addition, Coolidge didn't really think that if a crash happened, there was any significant problems, and in fact, if he was in charge in 1928, 29, 30, 31, and 32, 1931, not 28. 28 was his election year, or was the election year. But if he was in charge in 29, 30, 31, and 32, I don't think we would be talking about a Great Depression. I think we would be talking about a panic that Coolidge got us out of, because he would refuse to tax anything. And Coolidge was an expert user of what is known as the pocket veto. And what the pocket veto is basically, he wouldn't sign legislation, he'd just say, put it in his pocket and say, "I'm not returning this until you're out of session, and then I'm going to veto it. That way, you can't overturn my veto." And he was brilliant at using this. Now we come to Herbert Hoover, who manages to get himself into the F tier. And the reason why Herbert Hoover falls into F tier, he's better than Buchanan. He intervened too much in the economy, which caused it to crash further. Basically, he told businesses not to fire workers, not to reduce wages. And he tried to implement ill-conceived spending programs, and yeah, Hoover lives up to his name. He sucks. But he implemented spending projects which were temporary make work that didn't really do anything. For example, when the Hoover Dam was completed, what happened to all those workers? Well, there were no other jobs for them to go to, and the construction companies project was finished. So, yeah, they're still out of a job. So, at the end of the day, his policies were just Keynesian make work that didn't really do anything useful. That, and he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was a complete failure. He called in MacArthur to break up the bonus army, and a lot of veterans who decided that they wanted their pensions immediately because of the crash. And yeah, it was a miserable time all around. Now we get to a president whom, if this were my own personal taste, I would put in F tier. But it's not. This is also somebody who knew how to use the office. However, I won't be ranking him nearly as highly as his cousin. As a matter of fact, I'm actually ranking him below Andrew Jackson. And this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, the reason why I am not ranking him nearly as highly as Teddy, or even in the A tier, and why I'm ranking him so low, is because he served for more than 2 terms. He broke with precedent. And it's not just that. He was hesitant to run for his 3rd term, but decided to because others convinced him. And if you listen to his own cabinet, his Treasury Secretary basically said, his New Deal has not reduced unemployment, and we've only found ourselves deeper in debt. Ouch. High school team lost by 1 point and has not lost a game this year and now is out of the tournament. Oh, that sucks, World Church. That sucks. That is awful. But yeah, no, Roosevelt's 3rd and 4th. And now, I'm not going to be too critical about this simply because it was very likely we're going to get drawn into World War II at some point given Woodrow Wilson's precedent. But I don't think we should have gone and I'm absolutely going to say FDR made the right choice to go to war when he did because we'd actually been directly attacked. There's no way anybody can reasonably criticize that decision. Also, the general ineffectiveness of the New Deal. Most modern economic analysis from, say, the UCLA School of Economics, as well as, I would say, most astute studies, indicate that the New Deal really didn't do anything economically to help the United States. It certainly helped the American people feel that the U.S. government was actually doing something. It was benefiting the American people. And I also don't like that he tried to bully the court into passing the reforms that he wanted. Or not passing the reforms. Influencing courts to rule his New Deal constitutional. As the Supreme Court of his era was ruling that a lot of New Deal programs were unconstitutional, FDR said, I'll pack the court. I'll put 15 fucking justices on there. And what are you going to do about it? Thankfully, his own party told him, no, that's a dumb idea. It's going to get used against us at some point, and you're going to radicalize the conservatives against us. And, well, at the end of the day, may have been right. And at the end of the day, I think that decision to threaten packing the court is a really dumb decision, and thankfully it hasn't been tried. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that it's going to in the next time a Democrat gets in office. I'm genuinely afraid that they're going to pack the court, which I'm going to clear it up and say that court packing is not filling naturally occurring vacancies when they happen. Court packing is adding justices to flip the balance of the court as they happen. But, that's my view. That is a political scientist's view. What a political scientist would say. That is the traditional view of what court packing is. Anyway, so we move on to the next president, and that's Harry Truman, who also gets a B, but his is a much higher B. He gets to go above Andrew Jackson. And a lot of people don't realize just how solid of President Truman was. He wasn't terrible by any stretch of the imagination. He was just kind of unpopular because nobody knew what he was, and he was trying to play the balancing game of not doing too much because he took over for a president who died very early into a term. And that Truman was, he had ended the war. He made the decision to drop the bomb on Japan. And I think at the end of the day, I'm glad I don't have to make that decision. I'm not going to comment on whether or not that's a correct decision. I may have at some point, maybe the last time I did this. But yeah, Truman, he made the toughest decision any person in the history of the world has ever had to. And I think Truman wasn't as bad of a president as maybe some might say. Did he continue New Deal programs? Yes. But he managed the office very well, so it's hard to criticize him for that. Next president is Dwight Eisenhower, who also gets a very good rap as president. I'm putting him in B tier simply because his presidency was very good. He oversaw a decade of dramatic economic growth. He oversaw a boom in the middle class. He made sure to update our highway system, which improved commerce as well as defensibility of the nation. And I think it would be hard to find someone who didn't like Eisenhower's presidency, and he was intelligent enough to know that when the military and corporations have the same interests, bad things happen. He warned during his farewell address of the military-industrial complex. What he didn't or wasn't able to say was the military-industrial congressional complex, which basically added Congress in as the third wing of that institution, where Congress would vote to go into any war so long as it improved their own position. And unfortunately, I think the final analysis has said that Eisenhower was absolutely correct in stating that Congress, as well as the military and any corporations who make military equipment, are going to go headlong into war because they're going to see dollar signs. Because of, I'm going to say this, Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics looks at things and says, oh, look at this. We have a bombed out building that was destroyed by bombs we built. Well, guess what? We'll replace the windows and doors and rebuild it. And everybody benefits because around. Well, war only destroys and it ends lives, which is bad for everyone. But anyway, let's move on to the next president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he kind of gets the same grade as Eisenhower. Actually, fun fact about Kennedy, he is the only Democratic president to be a lifelong member of the NRA. He is one of the few Democrats who cut tax rates, especially in the modern era. And just like Coolidge before him, by the way, he was the first president since Coolidge to cut tax rates. The Kennedy tax cuts actually increased revenue. And Kennedy was not nearly as liberal as I think some people make him out to be. Yes, he was in favor of civil rights legislation. Yes, he wanted integration. Yes, he wanted that, but what is unconservative? In fact, you could argue that Kennedy was more conservative than Richard Nixon. And I was talking with the chair of my local Republican Party. Oh no, you're loosing? You're loosing, political machine? Not losing? Interesting. But no, I was talking with the chair of my local GOP, and he was talking about how Kennedy was actually more conservative than Nixon. Kennedy was a rabid anti-communist and actually was good friends with Nixon and sent a letter to Nixon during his gubernatorial campaign. Not gubernatorial campaign. It may have been a Senate or congressional campaign, but Kennedy basically told Nixon to beat that commie bitch, basically. But yeah, Kennedy also was deft and absolutely capable of handling the foreign policy challenges of his era, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes, somebody else has seen Futurama. Yes, that one Hawks fan. Yes, you're a fan of Futurama. I love it. Nixon's back. Damn the hippies. And then we go to Lyndon Johnson, whose Great Society, I'm not going to put him below Tyler, but I will put him below, oh, yeah, it was 1962. Yeah, I did get it correct. But no, Kennedy actually sent a letter to Nixon saying, "Be that commie bastard," or whatever. But yeah, so Lyndon Johnson was a massive, massive failure, I think. A lot of his policies were Kennedy policies that Johnson was able to successfully maneuver through Congress through, I'll call it big dick energy. Because Lyndon Johnson was proud of his... sorry, let me rephrase that. Lyndon was proud of his Johnson. So proud, in fact, he called it Jumbo. And a phone call to a tailor, he made explicit how large his Johnson was. Yeah, I know. I'm using Gen Z terminology. Ugh. God, I feel like I'm trying to appeal to hipsters. Yeah, Lyndon Big D. Yeah, that's accurate. I'm not. Yeah, that is absolutely accurate. Um, he was purported to require his staff to hold their meetings, their business meetings, in the toilet, in the restroom, while Johnson was having a crap on the toilet, and that he would walk up to senators who were against his proposal or on the fence and, drop his Johnson in front of hesitant members of Congress as a means of intimidating them into supporting his bills. Okay. I wish I was joking, but apparently this is verified information that I'm giving. Yeah. And for somebody who did this, I wouldn't have gone with the initials of a Spanish language porn star, LBJ. Anyway, let's move on to the next president. And yeah. No. I placed Johnson in D tier for a very good reason. We're all about the puns here. We're going to go with Richard Nixon, who I'm kind of mixed on this because he did some good things, but he also did a ton of bad. I'm going to put him in F tier above Buchanan. Tricky Dick Nixon. Yeah, he was corrupt. He more than likely had a slush fund. Yeah, his vote Nixon, his pants are firmly zipped. The problem with Nixon is he almost certainly had a slush fund, as he denied during the Checkers speech, which is a very good speech. I encourage you to actually listen to it. But, he also he knew about Watergate. He would have certainly been the president he would have been the first president to be removed from office, simply because of how bad of a scandal that was. He resigned because of it. And this is despite the fact that he absolutely slaughtered McGovern in 72 in the election. His policies and politics were certainly in line with the nation at the time, but at the end of the day, he was a corrupt president, and he certainly did some criminal behavior. And now we move on to Gerald Ford. Now, where does Ford rank? Well, because he barely had enough time to do anything, I'm putting him in C tier. He did what he could with the Congress that he had, and the reason why he's at the bottom is pardoning Nixon. And that is that. He pardoned Nixon, and that's enough. So be it. And then we move on to Jimmy Carter. I'm actually not going to rank him as badly as maybe I'd personally do it. He's a genuinely good person. He is a magnificent humanitarian. He is brilliant when it comes to human rights. The problem was the office and the moment he found himself in was just too big for him. And that he was unable to truly and properly execute the office as well as maybe he could have. in a different decade, I'm sure we would be talking about a great President Carter and how great of a president he was. The problem was in the 4 years he was in office, he found himself dealing with so many problems that it just overwhelmed him. And I don't think that he was able to rise up to the moment. But that is not a knock on the type of person he is. He is absolutely someone who belongs in the pantheon of great people. And you know what? He's from Georgia, so I have to like him. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Now we move on to the Gipper, the great communicator. And where am I going to put him? Well, historically, I've said that Reagan is too recent to properly evaluate, but now we can start evaluating him. And I'm putting him solidly in B tier. And the reason why I'm not putting him in A tier is he kind of signed some legislation that I don't like while he was governor of California. He implemented gun control just because the Black Panthers paraded around with assault rifles. The other thing was Reagan, he didn't cut spending like he said he would. He boosted military spending, yes, in an effort to beat the communists, but the Soviet Union was going to collapse anyway, so there was no need to do this. He could have just focused entirely on domestic policy and being a reasonable person, and I don't think there would have been an absolute problem. I think he would have had a great presidency regardless. And he really could have been... I think if he had focused more on cutting spending and cutting waste and paying off the budget, I would have rated him much higher than that. I think he also made too many appeals to try and make America more of a, quote, Christian nation and putting more emphasis on religion and government. But, you know, that's the libertarian in me saying that. But absolutely, his humor is unparalleled when it comes to presidents. I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. Or another good one, I've heard that as long as there are final exams, there will be prayer in schools. Or his various jokes about the Soviet Union, such as, so one year the Soviet Union passed a law that anyone caught speeding would be given a ticket, no matter who it was, how important they were, they would get a ticket. And so one morning Gorbachev is running late, and he tells his driver, get in the back. And he goes bolting down the highway to get to the Kremlin. And two motorcycle cops are watching him. And one of them pulls off, and a few minutes later, this motorcycle cop comes back. And he's like, so, his partner's like, so did you give him a ticket? Also, you're absolutely correct, Will Church, that Walter Mondale said that one-liner ended his campaign. But anyway, we go back. And the partner of that cop says, so did you give him a ticket? And he says, no, way too important. He says, no, you know the law. You're supposed to give him a ticket. He said, no, he was too important. Well, who was it? Well, I didn't recognize him, but Gorbachev was his driver. And anyway, so I just saw this comment. Lex Layton the Supreme Court may have said it, but there's this thing called the First Amendment, called Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of religion, all that stuff. It's generally understood that you can't establish a religion in the United States, regardless of whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever you want to name it, Shintoism, Buddhism. You can't establish a religion. Yes, the majority of Americans are Christian. Yes, the majority of Americans have a very Judeo-Christian background. But you cannot have a Christian government, because the government is not allowed to endorse a religion, nor are they allowed to favor one faith over another. There's a very good case known as, let me make sure I get this absolutely correctly. That way I'm saying the case correctly. Lemon v. Kurtzman. Basically, read up on that case. It may not infringe on religious rights, but it allows people to say, well, we're a Christian nation, so we can have Christian sayings, writings, and all this stuff. When it's very easy to argue that that would slowly turn into the establishment of a Christian America. Now, let's move on to the next president, George H.W. Bush, more famously known for "Read My Lips, no new taxes." Guess what? I'm not ranking him because he is too recent to rank. There are absolutely people who will find a way to rank him, but his presidency is a bit too recent to properly rank. He only passed away just too recently, and yes, he was an ex-CIA director. And I think he was very intelligent when it came to foreign diplomacy. And I'll explain that whenever it does become time to rank him. But he knew not to remove Saddam Hussein from power, and he was very capable, but his domestic policy left a lot to be desired. He famously did not care about it, which was probably a bad move in the term he found himself in. Now we move to William Jefferson Clinton, and all I'm going to say is that when it comes time to rank him in the future, probably 20 or 30 years down the line, it's going to blow to rank him. So there's that. Then we have George W. Bush, and I'm from the South, so is the three things that matter in the South are God's guns and George W. Bush. And I wish that was an exaggeration, but it's kind of true if I'm 100% honest. Anyway, and then we've got Barack Obama, who I don't think he's as bad of a president as the conservatives say, as conservative America says, especially conservative media. I also don't think he was as great as I think liberal media or liberal Americans will say. I think he was an adequate president. I think there's a lot of things I disagree with him on, but he wasn't completely incompetent. He knew what he was doing and all that stuff. W also was not as stupid as a lot of the media would like to portray. George W. Bush was famously hyper-intelligent to the point where he had an almost eidetic memory where he would remember everything. There's one story that I remember somebody wrote about where Bush had set up a series of cabinet meetings, 9 or 10 of them, And then he canceled the last one, and one of his aides asked him why. And George Bush simply said, well, and then he went through every single member of his cabinet, listing out what they believed and why they wouldn't change their opinions. To show you the intelligence and mental acuity of W, I think that's a very key example. Yeah, and W is a very good person as well. He's a humanitarian, much in the vein of Jimmy Carter, and he does a lot of stuff in Africa. Now, anyway, on to Donald John Trump, and I'm not going to say anything about this. It is way too soon to evaluate his presidency. And I think on the surface there's some good that he's done, especially in the foreign policy realm. There's some bad that he's done, and there's a lot to evaluate. And the only way to properly evaluate that is to take 20 or 30 years and say, okay, we're not going to touch this presidency and try to grade it until that is passed. So, yeah, that's where I'm going to sit on. And I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video live stream here. I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you next time. I want to take it easy. Have a nice evening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. If you were new, likes, comments, subscriptions, yada, yada, yada. You fucking get it. Good night, everybody.